The White House was glowing under the pale Washington moon when the confrontation began. Cameras were everywhere, red lights blinking, lenses focused, tension thick enough to taste. Kamala Harris stood at the podium, her tone firm, her confidence rehearsed. "We will not allow instability to spread from Africa to the rest of the world," she declared, her voice echoing through the press room like a final verdict. Her aides nodded behind her, their smiles tight, their eyes scanning for approval. To them, this was just another speech, another show of American strength. But this time, the world was watching someone else. Across the ocean, in a modest hall in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré watched the live broadcast on a small monitor. The room was silent except for Kamala's voice. "Those who defy our values," she continued, "should know that the United States will respond, economically, politically, and if necessary, militarily." The word militarily hung in the air like a loaded bullet. One of Traoré's generals shifted uneasily. "Mr. President, she's drawing the line." Traoré didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, unblinking. Then, a faint smile crept onto his face, not of amusement, but of recognition. "They still don't understand," he murmured. "They still think fear is power." He stood, his movements slow but deliberate. Around him, the room filled with a sense of quiet authority. "Prepare a response," he said. "Not through diplomats. Through truth." Within hours, news agencies across the world received an invitation, a live international address from the president of Burkina Faso. The subject line was simple: response to Vice President Harris. When the broadcast began, the setting was the opposite of Washington's polished press room. No flags, no teleprompters, no entourage. Just Traoré, standing before a simple wooden podium, dressed in his brown uniform, the insignia of his nation gleaming under soft light. His tone was calm, his words deliberate. "Vice President Harris," he began, his French accent subtle but firm, "you warn us not to challenge you. But tell me, why does truth frighten you so much?" A hush spread across the media feeds. The air itself seemed to pause. "We do not seek conflict," he continued. "But if your idea of peace requires our silence, then understand this: Africa has learned to speak. And we will not whisper anymore." The statement ignited a digital firestorm. In less than an hour, #Traoré vs Harris began trending across every social platform. Analysts scrambled for context. Was this defiance? A declaration? Or something far deeper, a shift in global power itself? The warning had been answered, not with fear, but with calm defiance. By dawn, every major network had picked up the story. CNN called it a shocking act of defiance. Fox News labeled it dangerous rhetoric from a radical soldier. But across Africa, the headlines told a different truth. Traoré speaks for the silent. In Washington, Kamala Harris sat in the Situation Room surrounded by advisors, the screen frozen on Traoré's calm, unwavering face. "He's young," she said sharply. "Too bold for his own good." Her national security advisor cleared his throat. "Ma'am, his words are resonating. We're tracking spikes in engagement from Ghana, Kenya, even South Africa. Young Africans are calling him the new Sankara." Kamala's eyes narrowed. "Then we remind them who leads this world." But even as she spoke, something was shifting, a tremor in the balance of global power. In Dakar, students painted murals of Traoré standing against a crumbling globe draped in an American flag. In Nairobi, markets buzzed with talk of a new Africa. And in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the streets were alive with chants, "We are not afraid." Inside the presidential compound, Traoré watched it all unfold. He wasn't smiling this time. "They'll retaliate," said his communications chief. "They always do." "I know," Traoré replied quietly. "But we are ready. This is not about me. It's about every African who's been told to stay silent." He turned toward the window, the rising sun painting his reflection in gold. "They want to scare us with their warnings," he continued. "But the day they lose our fear, that's the day they lose control." His military aide entered, handing him a classified report. "The U.S. State Department has requested an emergency meeting with ECOWAS leaders. They want sanctions reinstated. Traore placed the report on the desk and looked at the map of Africa behind him, a continent scarred but unbroken. Let them talk, he said. Every empire dies the same way, by believing its threats still work. Back in Washington, Kamala prepared her televised response. Her makeup team adjusted the lighting, but she couldn't shake the unease in her chest. This wasn't just another political sparring match, she could feel it. The soldier from Burkina Faso had turned her warning into a mirror. And the reflection wasn't flattering. As the cameras went live, the world waited once more, not to see who spoke louder, but who spoke truer. Kamala Harris stood behind the White House podium once more, but this time her tone was colder, her words measured with the precision of a blade. Let me be clear, she said, her gaze fixed on the cameras. The United States will not tolerate any rhetoric that threatens peace or undermines the international order. Burkina Faso's leadership should remember that their strength depends on global cooperation, not defiance. To the untrained ear, it sounded diplomatic. But to those who understood the language of power, it was a warning, perhaps even a threat. In Ouagadougou, the broadcast played on national television. Soldiers stood guard along the palace walls, their rifles gleaming under the harsh midday sun. Traore watched silently, his hands clasped behind his back. International order, he repeated softly, almost to himself. Whose order? Whose peace? His advisor, Lieutenant Coulibaly, frowned. She's trying to isolate us, sir. Economic pressure, sanctions, media attacks, they'll use every tool they have. Traore turned to him, his expression calm but resolute. Then let them. We've lived under their shadow long enough. It's time they learn that Africa no longer fears darkness. That night, Traore recorded a second address, this time not for the world's leaders, but for its people. My brothers and sisters across the continents, he began, his voice steady, his eyes burning with conviction. They call it order when they control our resources. They call it peace when we bow our heads. But true peace does not come from submission, it comes from dignity. Within hours, the message spread like wildfire. Young people from Nigeria to South Africa flooded the internet with the hashtag #AfricaWillRise. Videos showed crowds in Bamako waving Burkinabe flags, chanting his name. In the Congo, university students projected his speech onto dorm walls. Even in Western cities, the African diaspora gathered, shouting, "We are not your pawns." Meanwhile, in Washington, Kamala's aides scrambled to contain the fallout. "We're losing the narrative," said one press officer. "He's not just defying us, he's inspiring people." Kamala slammed her hand on the table. "Then we remind them who runs the world." But deep down, she knew something fundamental had shifted. Her threats, once met with silence, now echoed into defiance. And in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré, calm, unflinching, looked at a map of the world and said quietly, "They wanted a warning. Now they have a movement." By the end of the week, the diplomatic storm had turned into a global reckoning. Western media framed Traoré as a populist soldier turned revolutionary, while African networks called him the voice of a new age. Every speech, every gesture, every word he spoke was dissected and debated. The United States had expected outrage, instead, they had awakened something else entirely, admiration. In London, student protests erupted outside the French and American embassies. "We don't need saviors," read one banner. "We need respect." In Paris, African immigrants organized silent marches through the streets, carrying signs that read, "We are not your colonies." Inside the Oval Office, Kamala Harris was no longer smiling. Reports piled on her desk, diplomatic backlash, economic uncertainty, intelligence briefings warning of shifting loyalties across Africa. One line stood out on a CIA memo: Burkina Faso's president now commands greater online influence in Africa than any Western leader. Kamala tossed the report aside and muttered, "A soldier with a Wi-Fi connection. That's all it takes to start a revolution now." But in Ouagadougou, Traoré was not celebrating. He knew the danger of his rising influence. "They'll come after me harder now," he told his inner circle. "And they won't use soldiers first, they'll use stories." Indeed, the Western media began its assault. News anchors questioned his legitimacy. Opinion pieces labeled him a dictator in disguise. False reports of unrest in Burkina Faso began to circulate, seeded by anonymous, intelligence sources. It was psychological warfare, a campaign designed to erode trust and sow division. One night, Traoré's communications minister burst into his office, pale and shaking. "Mr. President, they're claiming we shot protesters in Ouagadougou. It's all over CNN." Traoré's jaw tightened. Were there protests? Peaceful ones, yes. But no violence. It's a fabrication. He leaned back in his chair, eyes cold. Then we show them the truth. They have satellites, we have people. Within hours, videos from citizens flooded social media showing calm streets, smiling crowds, and solidarity messages for their president. The hashtag #TruthFromAfrica began trending globally. Kamala watched the footage late that night. "He's turning every move we make against us," she whispered. Her chief of staff hesitated. "Maybe, ma'am, it's not just him. Maybe it's the world changing." Kamala didn't answer. For the first time, she felt something rare, not anger, not frustration, but the faint, unsettling chill of losing control. The confrontation had grown beyond words. It was no longer about speeches or statements, it had become a test of endurance, a struggle for moral ground. The White House was holding emergency meetings daily, while in Africa, millions of people were waking up with a new sense of pride. In Washington, Kamala Harris stood before her advisors, eyes sharp, voice cold. "If he wants to challenge the system," she said, "then let him face the consequences." On the table were proposals, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, cyber disruptions. "We'll choke his economy before he becomes a symbol we can't contain." But symbols are harder to silence than governments. That same night, Ibrahim Traoré sat in a small strategy room with his closest team. Maps of trade routes and digital infrastructures filled the wall. He listened quietly as his finance minister explained the latest U.S. sanctions. "They've frozen our overseas accounts and blocked several of our trade partners. This could cripple us within months." Traoré nodded slowly. "Then we'll build new roads," he said. "Not made of asphalt, but of unity." He pointed to the map. "We open trade with Mali, Niger, Guinea. We trade gold for food, fuel for grain. We show them Africa doesn't need permission to breathe." His words carried the rhythm of conviction, and the room, once heavy with fear, filled with determination. By morning, the plan was in motion. Burkina Faso announced a new alliance with its neighbors, a coalition called the Pan-African Front. The declaration spread across the world like wildfire. Headlines screamed "Defiance in the Sahel" and "Africa breaks away." Kamala Harris watched the broadcast, her jaw set. "He's building an empire of his own," she said bitterly. Her intelligence chief responded, "Ma'am, he's building belief. That's more dangerous." In Ouagadougou, thousands flooded the streets waving homemade flags bearing the symbol of a rising sun. Young men and women climbed rooftops chanting, "We are the system now," echoing Traoré's defiance across every city, every screen, every border. When the U.S. tried to pressure African leaders into condemning him, most refused. Even allies who once bowed quietly were now cautious, their statements vague, their loyalty uncertain. That evening, Traoré addressed the continent once again. "They call it rebellion," he said. "But this is rebirth. They say we are reckless, but we are finally awake. And to those who threaten us with punishment," he paused, his gaze steady as stone, "remember this, a people who have nothing left to lose can never be controlled." In that moment, it wasn't just Burkina Faso that stood against the world, it was every voice that had ever been silenced. Washington's response was swift. New trade restrictions, travel bans, and intelligence operations, all aimed at forcing Traoré to bend. But the more they pressed, the stronger his resolve became. In the dimly lit Situation Room, Kamala slammed her hand on the table. "He's a soldier, not a diplomat," she said. He'll break eventually. Yet the reports told a different story. Burkina Faso's economy was adapting, its people refusing to protest. He's turning sanctions into strength, one analyst muttered. He's uniting people through struggle. Across the Atlantic, Traore gathered his cabinet under candlelight, a deliberate symbol of endurance during the energy shortages. They think hardship will break us, he said. But we were born in hardship. We are forged in it. He walked to the window, gazing at the dark skyline of Ouagadougou. Let them cut us off from the world, he continued. They forget, the world was never ours to begin with. We build our own. His communications minister leaned forward. Mr. President, the people are hungry, but they are proud. They trust you. Traore turned, his eyes burning. Then I must not fail them. Every leader before me bowed when the world raised its voice. I will not. By midnight, word spread that Traore had signed new trade pacts with Russia and the UAE, bypassing Western sanctions entirely. Kamala watched the development live on television, her expression tightening. He's rewriting the rules, her advisor whispered. Then we remind him, Kamala said coldly, who wrote them first. But it was already too late. The world's balance was tilting, and for the first time in decades, Africa was no longer begging for permission, it was demanding respect. And Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who refused to kneel, stood at the center of it all. Days passed with no new statements from Washington. The sudden quiet felt heavier than any threat. African media called it the calm before the strike. In Ouagadougou, Traoré's advisors sensed it too. They're planning something, said Koulibaly, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were intercepted communications from a Western military base. Training exercises near Niger, he said grimly. But they look more like preparations. Traoré studied the reports in silence. They won't invade, he said finally. They'll destabilize. Starve us from the inside before they strike from the outside. He walked to the large map pinned on the wall. They've done this before, he murmured. To Libya. To Mali. To anyone who stood up. His tone hardened. But this time, the fire will burn both ways. That evening, Traoré held a private meeting with military leaders from allied nations. Mali's general spoke first. If they push you, they push all of us. We stand ready. The room filled with nods of agreement. Then we make it clear, Traoré said. An attack on one African nation will be met by all. The next morning, a statement was broadcast from Ouagadougou to every corner of the world. Burkina Faso will not surrender its sovereignty. Any attempt to violate our borders will be seen as an attack on the African continent itself. The declaration hit Washington like a thunderclap. Kamala Harris stared at the transcript in disbelief. He's daring us, she whispered. He's uniting them under his name. Her national security advisor replied, he's not uniting them under his name, ma'am. He's uniting them under an idea. For the first time in years, Western leaders realized that their power to intimidate was fading. The silence that followed was not peace, it was calculation. In the heart of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré stepped out onto the balcony of the palace as crowds below chanted his name. The air was charged with pride, fear, and destiny all at once. He looked up at the dark sky and muttered quietly, "Let them come." In Washington, the calm shattered. Kamala's advisors urged her to reassert dominance, to remind the world who leads. But even she felt the tide shifting. Public opinion in the global south was turning. Social media was flooded with clips of Traoré's speeches, his calm defiance spreading like wildfire. One late night, in a private briefing, an aide spoke nervously, "Madam Vice President, with all due respect, every sanction, every threat, it's only made him stronger. His approval rating across Africa is higher than any Western leaders worldwide." Kamala leaned back, her tone icy. Then maybe it's time we stop fighting his image, and destroy his foundation. Within hours, covert strategies were launched, fake news campaigns, economic sabotage, diplomatic isolation. Western media began painting Traore as the new strongman, a dictator in the making. But in Ouagadougou, the narrative collapsed before it began. The people had lived through manipulation before, now, they had learned to see through it. Let them talk, Traore told his communications chief. When lies can't kill truth, they only reveal the fear behind them. At dawn, a message from an unexpected ally arrived. The African Union's chair called an emergency session. The agenda, a continental resolution demanding an end to Western interference. When the news reached the White House, Kamala's fist tightened. "They're rewriting our rules," she said. "They're turning our world upside down." Her intelligence advisor replied quietly, "No, ma'am. They're building their own." That same night, Traore stood before his generals. The room was dark except for a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. "They will come again, with new masks, new tactics. But remember this," he said firmly, "we are not fighting for gold, or power, or revenge. We are fighting to remind them that Africa is not theirs to define." A quiet fell over the room. His words were not shouted, they were carved into history. And somewhere across the ocean, Kamala Harris realized that for the first time, America was not feared, it was being watched. The following week, the world witnessed something no one expected: silence from the United States. No press briefings. No statements. No condemnations. The great machine of Western dominance had stalled, unsure of how to respond to a man it could neither buy nor intimidate. Kamala Harris sat alone in the Oval Office, staring at the African continent on a glowing digital map. Every new alliance Traore forged lit up another point of light. "He's turning Africa into a fortress," she murmured. Her chief of staff broke the quiet. "Madam President, if this continues, Africa could become fully independent from Western systems within a decade." Kamala's eyes narrowed. "Then we won't give him a decade." Across the world, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the African Union in Addis Ababa. Cameras flashed. Delegates from over 40 nations watched him rise from his seat. When he spoke, the hall fell silent. "They say we are poor," he began, his voice steady, "but they forget, we are rich in the things they can never steal again: dignity, unity, and memory." He paused, scanning the room. "We built their empires, mined their gold, bled for their wars. And still, they call us ungrateful. But today, Africa remembers, and Africa refuses." Thunderous applause erupted. Some delegates stood. Others wept. The speech was broadcast across the world. Hashtags like #AfricaRises and #TraoreSpeaksForYous dominated social media. In Washington, Kamala watched the live feed in silence. Her advisor whispered, "He's won them all." Kamala turned off the screen and muttered, "Then he's not just defying us, he's replacing us." Back in Burkina Faso, that same night, Traore walked among his people, no guards, no motorcade, just a leader among citizens. "They think power comes from money," he said softly to a young boy holding an African flag. "But real power comes from the people who no longer fear losing it." And as he looked at the sea of faces around him, he knew, the system had shifted. Not through war. Not through force. But through courage. Weeks later, the UN General Assembly convened in New York. The air was heavy with tension, whispers of rebellion, alliances forming beyond the West's control. And at the center of it all stood two figures, Kamala Harris and Ibrahim Traoré. When Traoré entered the hall, the cameras turned. Delegates leaned forward. Even those who once dismissed him now watched with uneasy respect. His calm stride carried the weight of a continent that had found its voice. Kamala took the podium first. Her tone was firm, calculated. "The global order," she said, must remain grounded in stability, democracy, and cooperation. Her eyes flickered toward Traore. But some choose chaos, seeking power under the guise of independence. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Then Traore rose. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply waited for silence. When I look at this room, he began, I don't see cooperation, I see control. You speak of democracy, yet you fund dictatorships. You speak of stability, yet your bombs fall on children. You speak of freedom, he paused, his gaze meeting Kamala's, yet your chains still shine with gold. The hall froze. The words hung in the air like thunder. Even Kamala couldn't hide her discomfort. Traore continued, voice steady but burning, Africa is not your battlefield. Not your mine. Not your debt. You cannot teach freedom to those you once enslaved. Some delegates applauded cautiously. Others joined loudly. Within moments, the entire African bloc stood and clapped in unison. Cameras captured the moment, the young African president standing tall as the Western order faltered in silence. Kamala's hand tightened on the desk. She leaned to her aide and whispered, he's turning the system against itself. And Traore, hearing the echo of her earlier warning, smiled faintly. You told me not to challenge the system, he said, his voice carrying through the hall. But I did more than challenge it. I replaced it. Outside, crowds from Harlem to Harare were already chanting his name. History had shifted. The system hadn't fallen, it had evolved. And at its heart stood a soldier from Burkina Faso, who dared to speak when others stayed silent.